Hello and welcome to this recorded presentation on national policy requirements as part of your SENCO as Manager course at Sheffield Hallam University. My name is Jo Haines and I'm a Senior Educational Psychologist with Bradford Council. I have organised today's presentation into two sections of about 15 minutes each. This is part one. The key aims for today's session are firstly to examine national policy and requirements for SEND, to signpost you to sources of national legislation, advice and guidance, and to begin to consider the values and principles arising from national policy in terms of inclusion. This slide highlights where this presentation links to your learning outcomes in course documentation. Specifically, we are focusing on developing your knowledge in relation to national policy for SEN and disability equality. You will then consider the implications of this guidance on policies and practice in your schools and settings. Before we carry on, I would like you just to pause for a moment or two and make a list of the legislation and guidance that you already know about. I anticipate that you will identify many of the documents that I'm about to discuss. Okay, so I hope you spent a few moments thinking about the legislation and guidance that informs your practice. If you look at this slide, you can see the key documents that I will refer to today. At the bottom of the slide, you can see the Children and Families Act 2014 and Equality Act 2010. These are key pieces of overarching legislation and are closely linked. The other guidance and publications relate to these key documents. We will look at them in more detail shortly. Specifically the Code of Practice and the Equality Act 2010 and Schools Guidance. How does this make you feel? I imagine it seems quite overwhelming. However, I would urge you not to panic. Today, I will introduce you to some of the guidance and documents you need to know about. You will be more familiar with some than others, but I have included links and references so that you can follow them up with more detailed reading in your study time. In terms of the structure of this session, I want to start by firstly looking at the role of the SENCO as it is defined within current guidance, notably the Code of Practice. A full and thorough understanding of the roles and duties of the SENCO underpins the remainder of the session. I will then broaden out the presentation to look in more detail at the guidance and legislation you need to know about in your role as SENCO. The detail here on the role of the SENCO is from Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice. This is the section of the code most relevant to you in schools, although it is useful to have a good overall overview of the whole document. I have a paper copy, and although not particularly environmentally friendly, I do find it helpful to have to hand. Looking at this slide here on the role of the SENCO, key points to draw out include the fact that the SENCO must be a qualified teacher. Looking at the second bullet point, the SENCO has an important part to play in the strategic development of SEN and policy and provision within the school. As you progress through the current course of study, you develop a range of skills that will enable you to support and drive forward developments at a whole school level. One area that I particularly want to mention is the requirement that SENCOs have the sufficient time and resources to carry out these functions. It is a role that demands a high level of skill and also time. On this slide, you see the many responsibilities of the SENCO. You oversee the day-to-day operation of the school's SEN policy. You may also be involved in devising this policy and will certainly be involved in reviewing it. You coordinate the provision for children with SEND. You liaise with teachers, advising on the graduated approach to SEN support. You also advise on the deployment of the school's budget. You have an important part to play in ensuring that school resources are used effectively. This means you need to have a role in ensuring that provision is based around a good, solid evidence base, and also a role in monitoring the impact of interventions and provision. You will come back to looking at this in more detail in later sessions. The final bullet point here, you liaise with pupils, parents and carers. Moving on, you are the key point of contact with all external agencies across health and social care and the local authority. Note in the fourth bullet, your role is to work with the head teacher and school governors to ensure that the school meets its responsibilities under the Equality Act 2010, and again we'll come back to this shortly. This is something we are going to discuss in more detail later in the presentation. I hope that spending just a few minutes on looking at the role and duties of the SENCO contextualises this presentation, and that it is evident that your role is as a manager working at a systems level strategically. You are a key driver in the implementation and application of key guidance and legislation. Before moving on, I would like to share with you some of the latest statistics relating to special educational needs and provision. These are the recent statistics released in July 2020. As you can see, the number of pupils with education, health and care plans is rising, as is the number of pupils at SEN support without an education, health and care plan. Clearly, this means the workload of SENCOs is also increasing. In bullet 3, you can see that the most common type of need for pupils with a plan is autistic spectrum disorders. And for those at SEN support, it is speech, language and communication needs. I wonder how this compares to the type of need in your setting. Is it similar? Do you use this type of data and school data to plan your provision and training for staff? Finally, the information indicates that SEN is more prevalent in boys than girls. I'm sure this is a statistic you may want to reflect and debate at a later point. Moving on, we are now going to look at the Equality Act 2010 and associated guidance. Referring back to the role of the SENCO slides previously, the SENCO was seen, as in the previous slides, the SENCO was seen as key in implementing the responsibilities of the Equality Act 2010. Let's have a look at this legislation in more detail. The Equality Act is the overarching piece of legislation under which various advice and guidance documents sit. The Equality Act 2010 brings together 9 key pieces of legislation into a single act. The Act makes it unlawful to discriminate on the basis of 9 characteristics. These are called protected characteristics. These are detailed in the graphic you can see. Disability is one of the protected characteristics. When the Act refers to discrimination, there are 4 main types of discrimination and includes direct, indirect, harassment, and victimisation. Examples of each type can be found in the guidance for schools where they are placed into an educational context. And for reference, here I have included a definition of disability from the Act. Spend a minute or two reading the definition. In terms of additional guidance associated with the Equality Act, we have the Equality Duty, or to give it its full title, the Public Sector Equality Duty. This came into effect in April 2011 and provides the guidance on implementing the Equality Act. There are 3 main things you need to have regard to under the duty, and this is eliminating discrimination, harassment, victimisation, and other conduct that is prohibited by the Equality Act. Secondly, organisations need to have regard to advancing equality of opportunity between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't. The third is a requirement to foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't. Okay. So specifically in relation to schools, the document here refers to disability, discrimination, and also harassment. Firstly, a school must not discriminate against a disabled pupil because of something related to their disability. Secondly, a school should not harass a pupil due to their disability. The examples here on this slide are taken directly from the guidance. In reality, situations may be less obvious, more nuanced, and more complex than the ones that you see there. In order to further your understanding around this area, I have included some examples from recent case law in the links that you can see. An important area for schools in the Equality Act is the requirement to make reasonable adjustments. This is a duty that applies only to disabled people. So what does making reasonable adjustments mean? It means when something a school does places a disabled pupil at a disadvantage compared to other pupils, then the school must take reasonable steps to try and avoid that disadvantage. The Equality Act defines 3 main areas to the reasonable adjustments duty. These are provisions, criteria and practices, auxiliary aids and services, and physical features. The provisions, criteria and practice generally covers the way in which a school operates on a daily basis, including its decisions and actions. A school uniform policy might fall within this area. A reasonable adjustment would be to consider alternative clothing for students who may have significant sensory needs. In relation to auxiliary aids and services, this includes equipment and support for pupils. An example might be the provision of a braille for students who are visually impaired. The physical features aspect applies to the duty schools have as a whole to plan better access for disabled pupils generally in relation to the physical environment of the school. Schools and local authorities need to carry out accessibility planning for disabled pupils. The requirement to make reasonable adjustments is called an anticipatory duty, and this means that schools need to plan in advance what pupils might need. Involving parents and young people is important. As noticed at the top of this slide here, many reasonable adjustments are inexpensive and will often involve a change in practice rather than the provision of expensive pieces of equipment or additional staff. Take a few minutes to think about the reasonable adjustments you have made or could make in your setting for particular pupils. I will conclude the first half of the presentation here. In summary, we have looked at your role and duties as SENCO and begun to place this within the context of some national policies and guidance, specifically the Equality Act and related guidance. Okay, so time for a break.